Good morning. What a great crowd here today. Thank you so much for coming. It's my honor to kick off the 28th Annual Women's Health and Cancer Conference. My name is Randy Holcomb, and I serve as director of the UVM Cancer Center. As a GI oncologist, I care for patients at the UVM Medical Center and also across the lake at CVPH in Plattsburgh, New York. I also lead the Cancer Center in its mission to deliver exceptional patient care, conduct groundbreaking research, train the next generation of cancer physicians and scientists, and reduce the burden of care through prevention, screening, and outreach across Vermont and northern New York. This conference truly reflects this mission. Whether you're on the front line of patient care, navigating your own cancer journey, or advancing research at the lab bench, I hope you find meaningful points of connection today. Before we begin, I want to express my deep gratitude to everyone who made this event possible, especially our dedicated planning committee, Molly Berry, Jamie Kelly, Rohit Singh, and Julia Smithfelds. And all of our speakers and panelists today. Behind the scenes, it takes a village to bring this conference to life. And I'd like to acknowledge the UVM Cancer Center's community outreach and engagement team, especially Rachel Zweinenberg, Kate Strottmeyer, Isla Yersel, along with all our partners in continuing medical education, the Davis Center, the UVM Cancer Center volunteers, and all of you for being part of this special day. Let's do another round of applause. This event is also made possible thanks to philanthropic support from the Patty O'Brien, MD, Women's Health and Cancer Fund. When Dr. O'Brien founded this conference 28 years ago, her goal was to empower patients with knowledge about their disease. After her own breast cancer diagnosis, Patty's commitment to bringing the gap between research and the bedside became even more personal and profound. Today, the spirit of the conference lives on. About half of you are clinical practitioners, and half are patient and caregivers. We're joined by 375 virtual attendees from 32 states, Guam, Puerto Rico, and 6 countries. Together, we'll spend the day exploring the leading edge of cancer care. And what better way to begin than with a session at the intersection of artificial intelligence and oncology. Our speaker this morning, Dr. Lester-Coll, is Chief of Radiation Oncology at the University of Vermont Medical Center and Associate Professor at the Larner College of Medicine. As a radiation oncologist, he specialized in treating patients with prostate, lung, gastrointestinal cancers, sarcoma, lymphoma, and metastatic disease. His research spans clinical trials, health services research, comparative effectiveness, large database studies, cost effectiveness, and decision analysis. I know that his topic today is of great interest to many of you, and I'm sure you'll have questions. For the Q&A at the end of the session, Zoom attendees, please submit your questions via chat. A volunteer will read them aloud. In-person attendees, please wait for a volunteer to bring you a microphone so that our virtual attendants can hear you clearly. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lester-Coll.
Good morning. Thanks for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here and go over this very interesting talk with you. So this is entitled AI at the Bedside, and what I really wanted to capture this morning and just have a discussion about is, to reflect on, what is this technology, get a better understanding of how it works, how we're using it today, and how we might be using these tools in the future. I don't have any disclosures. However, I'm not an expert in this science, in this data science. I'm not an expert by training, but I've definitely trained AI, and I think probably most of you have as well. So we'll talk a little bit about how this all works. These are the learning objectives. Again, talk about how we're using this technology currently, what I do, radiation therapy, how this is being used in medical oncology as a support tool, how we think these are enhancing cancer care, and then, some of the guardrails that we need, some of the regulatory and practice considerations, and kind of thinking about where this is going into the future. So we're going to start by what is this? What is this technology and why do we care about it? What this can do in oncology. I'll share some data on how this is being perceived and again talk about ethics and regulations. Wanted to start off with just like a little bit of an interactive exercise here. Just show of hands, is anyone using AI? So the majority of the room, do you think you use it on a weekly basis? So weekly, daily, is anyone using this daily? So the majority of the people in this room lifted their hands initially, fewer for daily use. Does anyone just want to shout out, like, what are you using it for in your daily use? Where do you encounter these tools? Writing emails, right, great example. So even something like autocomplete, right, you start typing and something says, hey, do you want to write it this way? That's starting to use those algorithms. Anything else? Literature reviews, right? So we're starting to use these tools more for searching for articles and mining articles and pulling out data. Summaries, it's a great example. Writing notes, we're going to talk about that. How about like playlists? Anyone use Spotify? You know, it starts suggesting a playlist, right? That's starting to use those tools. GPS, right? These are all using this kind of technology. So just some Gallup data. So nearly all Americans are using at least one AI-enabled product weekly. And, you know, here's what we see, right? It's about 31% using 6 products. Most Americans are using several products weekly, regardless of what they do. I should say this data was captured in December of 24. My guess is that if this was done today, that these numbers are probably going to be a bit higher. So among those using 5 to 6 products, you know, yes, they're saying that they're using an AI-enabled product. And if you look, it's a little bit hard to read here. You know, what are these? These are things like Alexa, right? Google Assistant, Siri, navigation apps. So some of the things that we named this morning. So a lot of you mentioned that you're using AI. Do you trust AI? So much more hesitation there, seeing a lot of this. Would you trust it to make a playlist for you? Sure, okay, so some nods, GPS directions, more nods, recommending a healthcare provider. Mixture, some nods, recommending cancer treatment. So a lot of no's there, okay. So I think where we are today is we clearly are comfortable using this technology every day. We're using these tools, as we mentioned, to help us get through our days. But integrating this into medicine, into healthcare, into oncology, this is kind of a new space, and there's clearly some hesitation, right? And so I think that is similar to what the Gallup data shows. So here's some data showing that Americans have more negative than positive views about AI's potential impact in society. I thought this was very interesting. The number one concern, the spread of false information, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how these models work and where the answers from ChatGPT comes from, but there's certainly a concern that you could get false information. Very interesting to me is if you go to the bottom of this list, there's the most optimism for medical diagnosis and treatment, which was what there was the most hesitation of in the room here, right? So along with that, there's also evidence that as people become more aware of this technology and how it works and how it can be used, that leads to an increase, comfort with using these tools, right? So again, medical diagnosis and treatment is at the top of the list in terms of percent of net positive impact once there is awareness of the technology. So the next thing we're going to go into is basically, how do these large language models work? Does anyone know how ChatGPT works, roughly speaking? Some nods. Anyone want to just throw out like a really simple explanation? Like, what is it doing? How does it work? Yeah, great answer, right? So taking a lot of information, consolidating it, and then helping you answer a question, right? That's kind of the basic idea. And that a lot of information is basically the entire internet. Like the entire internet has been fed into these models. These large language models can pull from essentially all of the paper and literature and news articles and anything that's on the web has been combed by these algorithms, right? Which is kind of amazing. And really at its core, this is what it's doing. It is a prediction tool, right? So here's a simple sentence that says, I found. Would anyone like to predict what the next word in the sentence might be? A. And why did you pick A? Sounds right. It's a common word, right? You know, it's one we use a lot. It sounds like there's probably an article here, right? Other guesses? When? Out. Yep. A definite article, right? So with just these two words, we're already narrowing from roughly 100,000 words in the English language to probably some kind of article, right? A definite or indefinite article, right? So let's say it's the. What might come next? Much harder to predict, right? This generates many more possibilities, right? But what we did in that first exercise is due to the structure, right, the syntax of the sentence, we narrowed down from this big pool of like 100,000 or so words to a few that I heard a lot. Here, now suddenly we got to pull back and say, I don't know, this is a little bit hard to predict. So what if I tell you that this sentence comes from a course review? I give you a little bit of context, and the word is lesson. What might the next word be? Difficult. Plan, sure. We're getting closer, right? The context, right, exactly. The context is helping, right? And let's say we add, an adverb, very. We found the lesson to be very useful, right? Okay. So context, right? So again, we start from what is, after just two words, a really random gathering of words that we could isolate pretty well. We then have some difficulty because we're missing context, right? And this is what what we call large language models are doing. They essentially are tools that use statistics to say, after being trained and reading everything that's out there on the internet, they can say, okay, based on all this data, we think the next word is going to be this. And that is ultimately what these AI tools are doing. They are language models. They are taking all this data and they're using it to predict words. And I think this is kind of it's sort of an interesting and provocative idea, because if you have a model that has basically, seen everything that humans have written, it's all published out there, and it knows that, and it knows the context, it raises these interesting questions of, do these models understand meaning? What is meaning? If we ascribe words to phenomenon that we, observe out there, and these models can basically mimic that, do these models understand, what they're saying? These are questions that people are, debating, right? So what is AI? It is a system that analyzes data, recognizes patterns, and it predicts outcomes by learning from program commands. On the next page, we're going to talk about, what is generative AI versus other forms of AI, but basically what this was an example of a generative AI model, right? So this is AI that creates new outputs, text, images, code, rather than mimicking existing data. And how do these tools work? They're basically large language models, or they can, analyze images, but basically they're using those to create outputs based on what you put in. So this was a paper, kind of a useful framework for thinking about this in the Journal of the Medical Association, JAMA, that kind of just divides this AI evolution into three epochs, right? So first, we had these very simple algorithms. You would try and teach a computer to do a certain task, and this was really no different than basic programming, right? And so that was going on in the 90s all the way until about 2010 or so. And these were basically models where you would feed it an input, you would have some kind of algorithm, and something would come out on the other side. So I think the example they give here, right, is a series of questions to determine whether the picture is a cat or a dog. Okay, so very simple, like binary choice. The next sort of evolution of this is what we call deep learning. And the idea with deep learning is that you have a model and you are feeding it questions, and based on its answers, we give it feedback and say, no, that's not what we're looking for, try again. No, you're getting closer, keep going, right? And it's drawing off of systems that can communicate with one another. They're what are called networks, and that enhances the accuracy and the robustness of these models. So an example of this would be analyzing an X-ray and breaking it up into simple, like black and white little squares, or what we call pixels. And over time, you can train the model to identify what is in the image, what's in the medical image, right? So that's using that sort of deep learning algorithm. And then we move to these newer foundational models. These are the generative models. And this is basically where it can actually generate new content based on all of that information that it has. So this is what ChatGPT is doing. This is why you can ask ChatGPT to create something that it may not have in its database, in its archives, right? So it really is learning from what's out there. And again, it kind of raises these interesting questions of, you know, what do these models know and what do they don't know? So one of the chief, or I should say former chief scientists at OpenAI said, imagine a future where you can program a computer simply by telling it what you want in plain English. That is the promise of these large language models, right? Historically, this would have required robust amounts of coding and preparation, and now you can just simply type a command and you get your output. But one of the most surprising things about these models is their ability to develop new skills without explicit training. And this suggests that we're really just scratching the surface of what is possible. And I'll give you some specific examples of this. The same individual provocatively said, it may be that today's large language models are slightly conscious. Maybe, right? What does that mean? If these models have been fed all the information that's out there on the internet and they can generate new ideas, are they choosing to generate ideas in a certain way, right? Kind of a provocative idea. In response to that, another principal scientist said, sure, in the same way that it may be that a large field of wheat is slightly pasta, right? So, you know, people sort of fall on different ends of the spectrum in terms of where we are now and where we are going, but I think it's undeniably true that we've kind of unlocked something here and we've unlocked a lot of potential and we're still just kind of learning to scratch the surface of what we can do. So here's some interesting data. So this is a paper that looked at one of Google's models called Gemini and its pass rate on the US medical licensing exam. And a couple things I wanted to point out. I think one of the things that's, you know, really kind of incredible about this is just, if you look at the time period from, you know, December of 22 to November of 23, we see this huge increase in the accuracy of the pass result, right? So for me, what is striking is not the accuracy and the fact that the models are learning what questions are correct, but look at how quickly they learn to do this, right? Just a couple of iterations of model development and you go from like a, you know, under 50% pass rate to an over 90% pass rate. Like, to me, that's astonishing. That's really incredible progress. The other thing that I think is amazing about this is the Gemini model was specifically trained to answer medical questions. It was fed medical data. But look at how well ChatGPT-4 did, right? That was not a model that was trained on medical knowledge. That's just your standard kind of everything that's out there model. And herein comes this issue, right, of these are new skills without explicit training. That model was not explicitly trained to pass the USMLE exam, and yet it's doing so at a really high rate, right? So to me, that's pretty amazing. Now, for those of you who have taken the test or know what this content is, you know that a lot of this is really like data and factual stuff, so it's not so surprising that a model could learn this. And in fact, if answering these questions is what resulted in being a good, you know, healthcare provider, then, well, probably our medical students would be the best doctors out there because they're the best at doing this. But we know that there's something more to medicine than just answering questions, right? But to kind of build on that, another sort of new AI company on the space called Open Evidence, which we were just chatting about this, we're using now to help find data, to help answer our questions. They recently announced, this was just a month ago, that they got 100%. So their models are now passing our exams at 100% rate. But the real question, I think, is this, right? So can these models really start to reason? And so what is clinical reasoning? So here's a diagnosis that's out there, an iterative process by which a clinician integrates their own knowledge with information to form a case representation. That is often used to guide the iterative acquisition of additional information until a confidence threshold is reached to support a final diagnosis and plans for treatment, right? Okay, so the idea that it's not just a simple input, output, there's a right answer, that's a wrong answer, but we're trying to integrate all this information, data, lab values, imaging, history from the patient, symptoms, physical exam, and we're trying to, and as we get new information, we have to adjust what we're thinking, right? So are these models doing this now? I don't think so. Could they in the future? That's certainly a possibility, right? But one of the things I'd like to sort of emphasize in this talk is that I don't think this is a story about, is the AI going to be superior to us, and do we need to worry about the AI taking our jobs? I think the real story is about humans and us really learning to build better tools. I think of these as tools. Dr. Miner, who's dean at Stanford, I think put this very succinctly. AI should be used to support, not to replace clinical judgment, right? At the end of the day, it is the healthcare providers who are making the decisions and providing care. So what are some of the limitations of AI? This came from a paper that was also published this past year. As you can see, a lot of literature on this, right, in top leading medical journals. So in a real scenario, the details shift subtly, but significantly. There can be a new symptom. History can be reconsidered. There can be a new laboratory result. There can be different data. In these situations, reasoning is not about choosing the most probable answer, right? That was that exercise that we went through earlier. It's not about what is the most probable outcome, the most probable word. It's really reevaluating one's own approach in real time, right? So we think of that as clinical reasoning, right? So if there's a lung nodule, this is just an example, right? A lung nodule, a spot in the lung, and we feed that to a model, and the AI here, AI PAM, says, that's one picture, and then we essentially give it the same image but apply more clinical context. AI PAM can't tell the difference, right? There's more context here that the algorithm is missing, where the human has to work with the tools in order to arrive at the right decision as to whether to do anything about that spot in the lung or not. So how are we using this practically? So we're using this, to enhance physician-patient interactions. There's a lot of work looking into using these tools to reduce administrative burden, and then to support, and I think that's the key word, right? Support diagnostics, decision-making, and treatment delivery. So where is this showing up today? So earlier in the talk, a lot of hands went up when we talked about, how are people using this today? And I think a lot of people are using chatbots. Again, ChatGPT is being, kind of a common one that's out there. There are others. There are chatbots, and there are papers that I've seen and more studies coming out about using tailored chatbots to help support patients through their treatment. And the idea here is that, again, you can feed these models, you can train them, right? So if you train them on, let's say, support sort of pathways that we're using in the hospital, you can make that information more accessible to someone without necessarily having to get on the phone and hear about what they should do in a specific situation. So these are being rolled out, and there's actually some data I'll show that these are having a positive impact on our communities. On the provider-facing side, ambient listening, so these are basically AI scribes that we're using, improving diagnostics, and there's also some emerging sort of data that these tools can be helped to match individuals with potential clinical trials, which I think is really exciting too. So here's just an example of one of these chatbots. This was a one-year study where a chatbot was developed between patients with breast cancer. Pretty large study, over 4,000 individuals with breast cancer interacting with a specific, and again, the key here is that this is a specifically trained chatbot. This is not a general chatbot, but one that's been fed the information, like probably from these clinics, to help navigate these situations that are frequently encountered, right? So 130,000 messages a month, and what they found was adherence to medications improved. There were very high satisfaction reported among people who used the chatbot. They thought it was useful and it helped them navigate treatment. And this I thought was really interesting. They found it as a source of empathy and guidance to supplement but not replace the clinical team. And again, I think that's a very interesting finding, because I think most of us, when we think of interacting with a chatbot, think of something like this, where when we think about what is our role as oncologists and as providers, it's really that human element, right? Supporting someone, human touch. But it was very interesting to me that that came out in that study. Going back to Gemini, so Gemini is that Google trained model. So they have actually been doing this for over a year now. They have these chatbots. They've tested them out in a couple different specialties. So this was a dermatology one. And this is just a dialogue example of, someone saying, hey, I've got this rash. The chatbot says, hey, can you send me a picture? And it generates a differential diagnosis, and it helps steer the patient toward the right resources. I mentioned ambient listening. So this is a tool that we are using frequently here at the UVM Medical Center. This is basically a tool that I think it is actually a great use of a sort of large language model, where basically rather than charting or having to have a scribe, we can be in the room, we can be with the patient, we can be listening. We have the device that's basically capturing the conversation, and then these have gotten quite good at summarizing all that information succinctly into a medical note in order to save time on documentation and really to improve that one-on-one interaction in the clinic. So this has been studied, of course, before it was rolled out, and it reduced consultation times without impacting the actual patient interaction, improved experience and reduced workloads, and this improved documentation quality and operational efficiency. This is a really big focus right now in healthcare. I think a lot of you probably know is that we're having growing administrative burden, right? And so survey from US physicians across all specialties said the EHR systems get an F, they fail because of the increased odds of burnout, too much documentation. We're spending too much time in the EHR. We have constant ping of notifications and things to follow up on, and it's very hard when you're inundated with all of these notifications, well, which ones are really important here? Who really needs my attention now? What can I come back to in a few hours? What can I come back to tomorrow? It's very hard to sort of sift through all of that in real time because all of the information is suddenly accessible in these EHRs. So this is what the abridge, this is again the ambient listening looks like. So, again, with permission, we always ask consent, can we use these tools? And this will listen to a conversation, it will generate a note, it'll put it in the chart. The recordings are deleted after 30 days, it's HIPAA compliant, the data is encrypted and secured. And, here's, recently I just pulled this quote from the New York Times because they actually just covered this. The real benefit is that it captures details I would have otherwise forgotten. For those of us in primary care who are drowning in paperwork, this is going to be a huge plus. And I don't know, I'm sure there are people in the room who have used this, but I certainly have felt very similarly that a lot of detail that might be lost is really captured using these tools. There are other sort of emerging uses of potentially reducing burden, with these tools. So this was another sort of recent publication using generative AI to, so we have these now what are called in baskets, which basically are what they sound like. They're messages that often come from patients or other providers asking questions, and they get sort of put into this pool. And again, it can sometimes be difficult to identify, well, which messages do I need to respond to now? And so they rolled out a large language model that would essentially start some of those responses on the behalf of the provider. They did find that about a third of these were irrelevant. But interestingly, I find this fascinating that people on the patients on the receiving end find these more personable and more empathetic in terms of the way the messages are written and communicated. Physician responses were that they felt they were more incomplete or unresponsive compared to the generative AI tools. Other challenges, apparently they got very lengthy answers, and they had some difficulty interpreting lab results. I haven't used one of these personally, but I do know that there are large institutions in the US that have rolled this out. But I think this is kind of the main concern, right? And this is one of the, we haven't really talked about like one of the problems with these AI models, but this idea of what's called hallucination. It is sometimes these models, again, because they're generating new content, they're doing new things, they'll take all that data that's out there and they'll generate something new that may or may not be relevant depending on the context. So these are still learning. So again, on the topic of reducing burden, we can use these to potentially address queries, prioritize messages, provide more educational material. And the idea here is that we're kind of easing the burden of what comes into the electronic health record and help reduce some of those administrative tasks. So I don't have a problem with this. I think this is great. The smarter we make AI, the less it wants to do our jobs. That's kind of the point, right? So I think there's a lot of potential growth in this space. So this is a very, I think this is probably a relatively well-known application of some of these emerging AI tools, which is that there are tools that have been shown, again, going back to the ability of this is specifically the generative AI models can now interpret imaging, and then you can train them to interpret imaging and potentially identify, spots on scans, in this situation, a mammogram, to help decrease the number of false positives, decrease the number of false negatives. And this has actually been well studied, not just in mammography, but in lung cancer screening. And these are tools, again, the key word is tools. These are tools that the interpreting radiologist can use, so they can run the tool, see if the algorithm finds anything, and if it does, they can kind of hone in on that area, and ultimately the radiologist is going to decide whether this is a real finding or a superfluous finding that the tool, that the AI algorithm found. But what the data are showing is that it does seem to be improving our accuracy. So it is improving the radiologist's ability to accurately diagnose findings on imaging. So I think that's a really great use of this technology. This is kind of a little bit more in my my world. I treat a lot of prostate cancer, and I participate in a lot of clinical trials. And a group of people have taken thousands and thousands and thousands of data points from clinical trials. So when, often when someone will enroll in a clinical trial, there's sort of a question of, are you okay if we use some of your information for future research? And if you check that answer yes, then this is an example of something that might come out. So this wasn't something that was planned out of the sort of original studies, but they took all of the biopsy data, the imaging data, clinical data, and they fed it into an algorithm that ultimately did a better job of predicting how these individuals would do compared to our standard predictive models, which are based on, clinical information. What's the stage of the tumor? What do we see on imaging? But this AI tool did better. And so this is now being rolled out as a tool to help identify who benefits from certain treatments and who does not, based on aggregating all of this information, which otherwise is very difficult to do. So again, herein comes the power of these models. More sort of on the theme of clinical trials. So there are a lot of institutions that are actually using these not just to identify, what trials might be most appropriate, but also actually in drug discovery, right? So again, think of AI tools as essentially just very high, powerful information processing, right? And so we're trying to process all this information that's out there, biomarkers, drug targets, DNA signatures, all of this data. We're collecting all of this human data, and we may be able to use that to help identify, who may benefit from a novel therapy, right? So from drug discovery to patient recruitment, there are some institutions that are using this to actually help design their trials. So trial design can be very complicated. The statistics behind it can be very complicated. You want to make sure that whatever outcome you're studying, you've designed a good question that can be feasibly answered in a meaningful way, and that usually requires very powerful statistical approach. And so some of these tools are being helped to actually design the trials themselves. We talked about diagnostics and data analysis, and then some of the hands-on sort of applications of this, the chatbots, the scribes, multilingual communication, that's obviously another great use, right? And kind of applying some of the evidence-based guidelines. So here's just a little bit more on how can we use these tools to potentially identify potential participants for clinical trials. I think this is hugely important, right? There are a lot of individuals who may benefit from a trial, but they don't get the chance because of complex rules, distance, timing. Sometimes we're just a little bit behind in trying to put all this information together, and we've lost our window to enroll someone on a trial that they really might benefit from. So there are institutions that are using these to basically scan records, identify trials that fit for like a particular situation, maybe combine test results like scans and genetics to help improve matching, and then provide education. I think there's a huge opportunity here to provide really good tailored education, right? Going back to this idea that we can customize these, we can train them, we can feed them the educational tools that we're using in the clinic to make that information more accessible. So really the goal here is to make things easier, make things faster, help patients enroll on trials. I think this is a really provocative idea too, is that you can, and kind of going back to, I used to do more sort of modeling and data science, but you can do simulations with these tools, right? So you can use these to so-called test drive a trial design on a virtual cohort. Ensure that it's designed correctly, it's going to get the expected outcomes you're expecting, ask questions about safety, make sure these are well planned. Inclusion, help ensure trial groups reflect the diversity of the population, make these more widely applicable. That can be one of the pitfalls of clinical trials, is if you make your population too narrow in scope, you may find a really great outcome, but then you may not be able to apply it broadly into the general population, right? So we want to be thinking about this proactively when we're designing these trials. Automation is always, when we're looking for applications of this, automate, right? We want these to help us through the administrative hurdles, paperwork, organizing notes, side effect grading, all of this stuff that we can help use, hopefully, these tools to improve the throughput in our trials. So, it's a lot of information. I'm going to move into a little bit of my world in radiation oncology and where we're using this. So this is a paper I co-authored with Dr. Topol in the Lancet a couple years ago, actually back in 2021. And we wrote back then that about a third of individuals in radiation oncology were starting to use AI tools in the generation of radiation therapy plans. And that has now jumped up to, depending on, this is just some recent papers I found, well over half, right? Well over half of our institutions now are using these tools in some way to help us develop individualized plans for patients. And so again, here's that word automation, right? We're thinking about what steps in the process can we increase efficiency by using some of these tools to help us increase access to therapies in the clinic. That's really the ultimate goal. So the typical workflow for delivering radiation in cancer care is we scan someone, we do what's called contouring, or we literally draw on the scan where do we need to treat, where are the important organs that we want the radiation to avoid. We do a plan, we check the plan, and we treat. And at every one of these steps, there's opportunity for some of these tools to help us through this process. So this is an example of a tool that we are currently using, and I think most, in that survey of over 50%, probably most are using a very similar tool like this, where we bring in a scan, and this software can say, hey, here's where all these really important parts of the brain are where you don't you got to be really careful where your treatment goes. And historically, this would require someone to sort of sit down and go slice by slice and literally draw out where these are. And this will just give you a kind of a quick, here's where they are. And you dosimetrist or doctor can tweak them, but it's extraordinarily helpful, and it helps just speed along the process. And it's just one step, but again, it's this sort of, building up of all of these individual steps, right? If we can take one piece from that workflow, make it more efficient, we've suddenly reduced our time to getting someone through the door and hopefully onto the treatment that they need. This is where, again, in our field in radiation oncology, this is kind of the biggest emerging space and opportunity, I think, for AI to really transform the way we deliver care. So the traditional way of planning radiation is that we do a scan and we create a plan, and then we have the patient come back for maybe one treatment, maybe 5 treatments, maybe 20. But the treatment that's delivered is based on the way that the patient was set up and scanned prior to starting. In reality, we know that things change during treatment. Tumors may respond, they may decrease in size. There can be changes with the internal organs. If someone gets sick, there could be lung changes, or if we're treating something, in the abdomen or pelvis, a lot of those organs inside there can be moving around. And so there's always been this hope in our field that rather than use this traditional approach, that maybe the technology may get to a point where we can scan and come up with a plan in real time and deliver that treatment in real time right there, without having to use the scanner, the data that now maybe is several weeks old, and oftentimes that's fine and appropriate, but here's an opportunity where under the right conditions we can make adjustments. So we call this adaptive. This is called adaptive planning. And this is what this looks like kind of in real time, where this is an example of a radiation plan that's being delivered to the pelvis. It's treating a lymph node. And the way this works is that you get this scan, and you'll get your reference plan. That is the plan that maybe the data set we acquired a couple of weeks ago, and we'll say, and due to these AI-guided tools, so these tools can basically do all the contouring, the drawing that I mentioned, but then they also help do the plan. They help come up with a new plan based on the anatomy of that day. And that's that step where that automation process just is not possible with our current workflow. So that's really allowing us to say, okay, if there's been a significant change, we can now do this in 20 minutes as opposed to maybe several hours, and that allows us to make adjustments in real time. So that's kind of the idea behind this adaptive planning. And what you'll be presented with, and I've seen this in real time, and we're going to actually have the ability to do this here at the medical center, is you'll get your old plan, you'll get your plan of the day, and then basically the team, the physician, can decide which one they want to deliver. And so there's a lot of research coming out in the space on, when is the appropriate use of this technology? When do we want to use it? When is it helping? When is it not? But I just want to share that this is kind of the emerging space that we're entering. And more centers around the country are taking up this technology. So just to transition into, what are some of the patient perspectives on this and why it matters. So this isn't just about technology. But again, thinking back to those questions I asked early on, do you trust this, right? It affects trust. It affects autonomy, care experience. People want to be informed when AI is being used, as they should. And we want to make sure that patient voice is aligned with the principles of informed consent. And so there are some ethical things to think about here, right? So these tools can help us diagnose earlier, personalize treatment, reduce burden. But we got to make sure we have safeguards, right? So risk include bias, privacy breaches, errors, and eroded trust, right? So Uncle Ben, you're always in my mind, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Bias and health inequity. So this is only as good as the data it's trained on. I think this is a huge issue, right? So a lot of people are studying this because this directly impacts people. If you train these models, you have to be very careful of where is the data coming from. Is it applicable to the entire population? Are we biasing the data by including overrepresenting certain groups or underrepresenting certain groups? Like, this is a huge issue. And so there's a lot of work being done in this space to ensure that we're training these models, particularly in the medical space, in an inclusive way. So incomplete data sets can result in unequal care, especially for underrepresented groups. And there is already emerging data that some of these tools show lower accuracy in minority patient demographics and rare diseases because they lack diverse training data. That makes perfect sense, right? You got to make sure that the models are being exposed to all of the data that's out there. There are some what are called bias audits that are being developed. So this IBM AI Fairness 360 is actually a really interesting one. This is like a Python algorithm that you can use to, it will basically scan your algorithm, and it's been trained to identify sources of bias. And it'll say, hey, you know, it looks like this is being trained too much on this population, or you haven't thought about these issues. So there are programming tools, there are algorithms that can help deconstruct your algorithms to make sure that they're more equitable, which is great, but we need to make sure that these are, you know, available widely. Privacy and data security obviously is a major concern too. Obviously there's protected health information being stored here, and that raises questions about confidentiality. There are some interesting models that are out there to try and address this. So this idea of federated learning, which is actually something being used over in Europe. It's called Feature Cloud. But the idea there is that you have multiple institutions that are de-identifying all their data, and they're encrypting it, and they're pooling that data to train those models, again, with the idea of trying to ensure that they're representing all the populations that they may be used on. So this is being proactively developed. There's something called differential privacy, which basically adds noise to data so that it can't be tracked and identified. This is actually what Apple and Google use in their current AI tools. So there are safeguards out there. This is something that I think we need to be thinking more and more about. Again, what do people think of this? So specifically the use of AI in cancer, this was a survey of over 400 people who received radiation therapy in Australia, and the majority supported, you know, using some of these tools to help basically physicians do their work. But there was a lot of uncertainty sort of expressed about, you know, this idea that we want to make sure to preserve the human touch, right? And so this is the ultimate decision and the thing that we're grappling with, right? Use ChatGPT, use a human. But, you know, one of the points I hope is coming across clearly is that, you know, we are really viewing these as tools, and we don't view these as a way to replace our providers. Some additional data on patient perspectives on AI. So this was a survey, 1,200 individuals. This was published recently, tested how ads about physicians using AI influence perception. In every condition, the portrayed physician was perceived as significantly less competent. So you know, to me, this is, I think we've got a lot of work to do. I think we have a lot of education to do to hopefully provide some reassurance that basically this is not what we're doing, that we're not just, you know, looking at a scan and saying, you know, how's my MRI look? Yeah, 1 second as I look it up in chat. Right, this is not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to help use these tools to improve our efficiency and honestly to reduce that administrative burden so we can spend more time with patients. Just some additional data. So 4 virtual interest groups from 30 populations in Canada. Participants completed a short AI education module before discussions, and, you know, here the aim was to understand how patients want to be engaged in developing AI for healthcare. And, you know, I thought these were really some important conclusions. Involve patients early, you know, at the problem definition stage, ensure that we have diversity, ensure that this reaches beyond hospitals, use multiple languages and settings, provide the education. The basic AI orientation helps people understand, you know, what we're using this for, how this can help improve care, respect lived experience, treat perspectives as expertise, and provide fair compensation, and really build relationships. So I think the AI train has left the station, right? So this technology is out there, it's being used, it's being implemented. It's going to be adopted with or without us, right? So the question is, do Are we at the front lines, and are we going to shape it responsibly, or are we going to let it shape us? And we want our patients, we want our providers, we want us at the center, not the tools. This is a tool. You've heard me say that word a lot today. It's a tool to extend and not replace humanity in care. I think if we build guardrails, engage patients, prioritize equity, I do think that this can help us deliver smarter, safer, more compassionate care. So thank you very much.
If anyone has questions, we do have 2 mics on the sides of the room, and I can also bring a mic to you if anyone would like to raise their hand, and I'll bring it.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Actually, not a medical professional here. My background is technology, so that's where this question may be coming from. Clearly, it takes a great deal of human expertise to develop all of this, and a great deal of technological infrastructure. With the current fear of more rural hospital settings or places where you could treat a cancer patient closing just because of funding and a variety of other things, do you see this, as long as you can maintain the right connections, could this lead to being able to open radiology or whatever centers more scattered around to make it easier for the patient to get the treatment they need? Do you see that as something in the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a great point. So the answer to that, I think, is yes. And I think that these tools can help small rural hospitals in a number of ways. So you mentioned one of them, which is maybe assisting radiology. Not to get on too much of a sort of side tangent about this, but in the setting of smaller hospital budgets and really constrained resources, which is frankly the healthcare environment that we're in, health systems are looking at these tools as a way of trying to, again, reduce some of that burden to improve access to providers. So this is actually being looked at as some of these tools, particularly the scribe tools, as a way of trying to help improve the sustainability of some of those smaller scale hospitals. So one would be more support for the providers. You mentioned, potentially improved diagnostics, which I completely agree with. And again, some of the other, I think, educational and again, supportive opportunities to help physicians provide potentially more tailored specialty care in those smaller environments where they may not have the same resources as kind of a larger academic center. So I completely agree with you. And generally speaking, these tools, from a budget perspective, if they're rolled out in a thoughtful way, can actually, I think, help improve the operations of those smaller hospitals.
We have a question from Zoom from Marisol asking, what steps are you taking or are being taken to promote trust to the public, specifically the population that is less well-versed in technology?
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Really important. So I view the onus really on us as the providers to provide that education. So I brought up that issue of informed consent, and some of the data showing that the trust really depends on open communication and education about how these tools are being used to help. So I think that's first and foremost, I think that's on us as the providers to really provide that education, explain, what we're using these, make sure that we have informed consent, just like any research setting, just because they're new and they're not fully well understood. I think at a larger level, I think we need to probably also do a better job of providing just more general education on this topic. But at the end of the day, I think it's up to the providers.
So I see that there are 2 questions. I'm going to hand over here, and then Matt, I'm going to have you wait and do yours last, and that'll be the last 2 questions we'll have time for this.
Are women considered one of the underrepresented groups, considering that a lot of medical research has been done based on men? Therefore, the data that's being scraped on the internet is perhaps unfairly already biased against women? And is there a way to use AI to address the algorithm?
Yeah, great question, and I completely agree. There are a lot of demographic populations, including women, that I think are not well represented in a lot of these training models. I think that's the bigger task there on the larger scale, these more public models. I think that's a larger undertaking to help fine-tune them. I think the ones that are being used for research and development and implementation in the clinic, we have a little bit more control over ensuring that, again, the training data is really reflecting the demographics of the people that we are trying to provide care for. So there is an opportunity in kind of the healthcare research setting to make those adjustments, but I worry about this issue on a larger scale very much.
Yeah, Nat, that was an incredible talk. Thank you. Just one comment. I wanted to maybe extend your idea, and I love that, of viewing AI as a tool, but probably beyond a tool, it's also, in most of these instances, a test. And what I mean is we've played with this around your pulmonary nodule problem in our research lab. And if I tell you, hey, Nat, you got a spot on your lung, and I'm worried it might be a cancer, your next question is going to be, how worried? Right? And so all of these predictions, like if you use an AI model to predict if that spot on the lung is a cancer or a scar, there's a number behind that, and it's going to say it's 50% sure, 60% sure. But the companies don't want you to see that number, right? They want you to view these models as dichotomous, as yes or no, black or white. And in medicine, as providers, as consumers, and man, really as patients, we care a lot about how good that prediction is. And so that's the thing I think that we need to advocate for from these companies, particularly in the medical space. But it's one of the ways that you're going to be able to see bias. It's one of the ways that you're going to be able to see these things hallucinating, confabulating, all these kind of problems. So that's just my sort of advocacy speech.
Completely agree. And we have prediction models like this. I mean, whether they're AI or not, we get these tests from companies that give us a number, a score, a likelihood score, and what does that mean, and what does that mean for the individual? And it's not always clear, to your point, right? And some of that additional data, those predictive models, not all of that is necessarily being communicated to us. But again, I think at this juncture, at this stage, that falls on us to integrate that data point with everything else we know clinically, right? So that's where the history comes in, the additional information that the predictive model may not have, and we say, okay, this is just one piece of the puzzle, and we have to integrate it into, the knowledge we do have to move forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lester-Coll. It was an amazing talk to kick off our day. It's a little insight into the brand new world that most of us who went into medicine didn't realize would be such a big part of our lives. So we are all learning along with you and trying to keep up and trying to look like we know what we're doing, with AI every step of the way. My name is Molly Berry. It's my privilege to serve as the executive director of this conference. As a medical oncologist at the University of Vermont Cancer Center, I know how special it is to bring together patients, researchers, clinicians, caregivers, and community members for a day of learning. And I'm thrilled you're all here joining us virtually or in person. Before we head to our next session, I have a few housekeeping details to relay. First, on the back of your name tag, you'll find a list of the lectures you've selected, along with the room location. As a quick reference, we are in the Silver Maple Ballroom right now. The Sugar Maple Ballroom is on the other side of that wall. You'll walk outside and come back around to go in. For Zoom attendees, you can find all the links to the sessions on the conference website. I also have an important note for Zoom attendees who would like to claim continuing medical education credits. Please be sure to enter your full name and email address when prompted after clicking a session link. CMIE will send you an email following the conference with details about how to claim credit. Here in the Davis Center, we're joined by 20 wonderful exhibitors, and we intentionally built time into the schedule for you to visit with them in the Fireplace Lounge. Restrooms are also located on each side of the lounge. Further down the hall, in the Jost room, you'll find Vermont artist Lisa Sylvester's exhibit, Still, which shines a light on the potential that exists on the other side of choosing to go flat after mastectomy. You can turn in your ticket that you received at check-in for a free copy of the Still Compendium. My co-chairs and I had a chance to check it out before the conference started, and it's amazing. Please make sure to get down there. The photographs are fabulous. The stories are amazing. So I just want to make sure that everyone makes it down the hallway, because I know sometimes it can get hard to get all the way down there. I also want to extend a special thank you to our partners at the Osher Center for Integrative Health for arranging today's Reiki and acupuncture therapies. And lastly, the shuttle to the parking garage will run continuously from the Davis Center Oval driveway on the 3rd floor. And there will be a drawing for the beautiful centerpieces at the close of our afternoon plenary, so stick around for the whole day. Our next session will begin at 10:10. If you're registered for Cancer Knowledge plus Research plus Advocacy equals Survivorship, you'll meet back here in this room, the Silver Maple Ballroom. And if you're registered for Target Acquired, Locking Onto Cancer with T-Cells and Toxins, please go to the Sugar Maple Ballroom on the other side of the back wall by way of the Fireplace Lounge. Before you leave, please be sure to clear your breakfast items, and I hope you all have a wonderful morning.